by former Congressman and independent presidential candidate John Anderson. And all weekend, C-SPAN 3 turns to history. Saturday, we'll hear from a number of people involved in Watergate, including former Washington Post editor Ben Bradley and Bob Woodward. It's all this weekend on the C-SPAN networks.
Next, Senator Edward Kennedy on the U.S. Senate's filibuster agreement. His comments Wednesday at the New York Law School are about 45 minutes. He was introduced by former staff member attorney Kenneth Feinberg.
I now introduce Senator Kennedy. Unless you live on Pluto, there's not much I can say that you don't know about Senator Kennedy. I mean, what can you say about Senator Kennedy? Whatever your own personal definition of the public interest, whatever it is, Senator Kennedy and the Kennedy family satisfy that definition. You don't have to agree with everything that he stands for. If you work for him, you better agree for everything he stands for. But whatever the definition of the public interest, it is Senator Kennedy. He's been in the Senate now for over 40 years. With God's grace and a boost from the voters of Massachusetts, he will soon, relatively speaking, serve longer in the U.S. Senate than anybody in American history. And you know, he is an extraordinary public servant. Everybody knows it in Washington, around the country. I mean, everybody, Republicans, Democrats, when you speak to people down in Washington, who's the best? Senator Kennedy. And he returns to Massachusetts this year for a campaign, which he will tell you is not a foregone conclusion. He litigates. He used to litigate. He used to litigate as a prosecutor. He runs every campaign like it's, you know, all the cards are on the table, and he just does it. And he does it day in and day out. So when it came time to pick a lecturer for the second lecture in the Shainwald series, who better than the senior senator from Massachusetts who stands for the public interest day in and day out, my mentor, my boss, my friend, Senator Kennedy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ken, for your typically kind and generous introduction and presentation. Ken, as you know, and I go back a long way. It was just after the report on S1 came to the United States Senate, and I was on the Judiciary Committee, and Ken became a member of my staff, and he said, look at this, what was called S1. It was a terrible piece of recommendation legislation, and he said, you know, we have a real chance to recodify the criminal code. And I said, look, Ken, that may be something you might be interested in, but I'm health, I'm civil rights, I'm protecting of individual rights, and I'm education. I want an honor walk down. No, but we can recodify. It hasn't been done in 200 years. And do you know that in that criminal code, there's all kinds of thought process that goes in, knowingly, willingly, wantonly, lasciviously, all these kinds. I said, I know that, but I don't want to really get into that because I'm not sure we can get the only way. 3 years later, Senate recodified the criminal code. We had 67 hours of markups. The House Representatives failed to recodify the criminal code, and it's going to be another 200 years before there's another Ken Feinberg is able to talk another senator to go out and try and do it again. But it is a little piece of history that if any of you were interested in the recodification. Let me say, most of all, I'm considered a friend of the Feinberg family. That's a wonderful family that I got to know in Massachusetts during my political careers, and it was just his mother, a dear friend, his brother, the whole family from Brockton, and we're looking forward to being there in a short period of time to give some pay tribute to what Ken has been toasted as legitimately and rightfully he should be for the extraordinary public service. But I think the one that's going to make the greatest difference to him will be among his friends in Brockton, Massachusetts in 2 or 3 weeks, Ken. So I join with all of you paying tribute to really an extraordinary career in public service. All of you know he's the model of the familiar slogan of the Army Air Corps in World War II: the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. Many of us feel Ken would be the perfect special master for the United States Senate these days. I'm grateful to Sidney Shainwald as well. She's a remarkable public interest lawyer herself, and I think Ken captured the extraordinary spirit of Sybil in his opening comments, and has been a benefactor of so many important and good causes that I believe in deeply, including the important series of lectures as an extraordinary tribute to Sidney. And he too devoted so much of his professional life to the public interest through many years of work for the Consumer Union. And I see Jim Guest, who was a member of our staff and has been a terrific consumer advocate for years, and I'm so glad that he's with us today. There are a number of others that have been a part of our whole family. Mike Posner, the Human Rights First, and working on those issues which are so important, and I know that the Shainwald family cared very deeply about. I want to thank the Dean very much for inviting me here today and for enabling the law school to be such a vital and responsive institution in so many fields, and for encouraging the school and its graduates to be active in advancing the public good. The subject of my remarks today is what's ahead, but history is really what I came to talk about, and how the future will look upon what happened in Washington this last month. For May 2005 in the United States Senate was one of those special times when we could sense history actually happening around us. We felt that someday, 50 or 100 years from now, a future historian would be trying to sense what it was like back in 2005 when the nuclear war over the filibuster reached, and whatever it was, we reached last week. Some of us felt a little like the way President Kennedy felt in October 1962 when he first heard that the Soviet ships had turned back during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But was it the end of the war, a truce in the war, or just a lull in the ongoing battles of the war? During the past week, we have heard all of those descriptions, and we can only guess what will come next. Let me at least give you this participant's view so far. The Senate has 55 Republicans, 44 Democrats, and 1 independent, a former Republican who now usually votes with Democrats. The Constitution specifically gives the Senate the power to make its own rules. And one of those rules makes it completely clear that it takes 60 senators to shut off debate on legislation, on a treaty, on a nomination, on anything except a rules change, which takes 67 votes. When I first arrived in the Senate in the 60s, party lines were less rigid and civil rights was the most divisive issue. And many Republicans were as progressive as any Democrats, and many Democrats were as retrogressive as any Republicans. The Republican leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois, was indispensable in producing the votes needed to shut off debate on the landmark civil rights legislation of those years. In a different world, in today's Senate, where party line voting is much more common, the partisanship came to a boil over President Bush's judicial nominations when it became clear that the president had delegated the selection of key lifetime appellate judges to the most ideological, extreme elements of his constituency, and demanded that all Republicans toe the line. For Democrats, our only effective response was the filibuster, and though it had acquired a bad reputation when it was used to delay civil rights legislation in the first 60 years of the 20th century, it was still central to the essence of the Senate. The role of the framers of the Constitution gave us was to be a moderating influence on the House of Representatives and the White House, the parts of the government most likely to move with the shifting winds of public opinion. The Senate is the heart of the system of checks and balances. They build to protect the country against both the pressures of transitionary popular opinion and the overreaching of a popular president. The framers had lived as subjects of a tyrannical monarch with absolute power, and after winning their independence, they wanted to make sure that the new nation never faced that prospect again. And they embodied that assurance in a strong Senate, with 6-year overlapping terms compared to the 2-year terms in the House of Representatives or a 4-year term for the President. And they gave us special powers, including joint power with the President over judicial nominations. To make sure that the federal judges are independent, the framers gave them the lifetime appointments and prohibited any reduction in their pay. During much of the Constitutional Convention, to make judges completely independent of the President, the framers planned to give the Senate the sole power to appoint judges. Founding fathers, up to the last 8 days, had given the complete appointment power to the United States Senate. It was only in the last 8 days that they made a judgment that it was going to be a shared power, which runs right into the face of the popular concept that if the President is going to nominate, the Senate ought to be a rubber stamp and just go ahead and approve unless they could find something wrong with that person. Read the debate at the Constitutional Convention, the last days of it, and you'll come to an entirely different viewpoint. In a last-minute compromise, they divided the power between the President and the Senate, allowing the President to nominate, but requiring the Senate's advice and consent before they take their seats on the court. In the 2 centuries that followed, numerous battles erupted over the nomination of particular judges, but the nearest precedent to the current impasse took place over President Franklin Roosevelt's court-packing plan in the 1930s, where the very conservative Supreme Court of that era was consistently holding parts of FDR's New Deal unconstitutional. Roosevelt proposed legislation to expand the number of justices so that he put more liberal views on the court. In a sense, his plan was the nuclear option of its time, and the Senate refused to accept. The impasse was eventually resolved when, just as the debate reached its most intense, one of the sitting justices changed his views of the constitutional power of the President and Congress, and the crisis eased, and the action of the justice became known as the switch in time that saved 9. In recent years, President Bush began overreaching in selective nominees to key federal courts, and Senate Republicans gave their lock-stock support to them. The filibuster became the only realistic way for the Senate Democrats to assert their advice and consent. We used the method extremely sparingly on only 10 of the most blatantly extreme judicial nominations, allowing 210 others, most of whom we would not have selected ourselves, to be approved by the Senate. To get some idea of the modesty of our resistance, consider the Republican senators blocked over 60 of President Clinton's judicial nominees through various methods of preventing a Senate vote. Repeatedly, President Bush rejected our clear advice to select new nominees and insisted on the ones he had already submitted. He gave 2 of them recess appointments, although at least one was done in a way that was probably unconstitutional. After the 2004 election gave him a larger number of Republican senators, he renominated most of those we had already declined to approve and developed a far-out parliamentary strategy to circumvent the filibuster. The Republican mantra became, every judicial nominee has a right to an up and down vote on the Senate floor. They threatened that if the filibusters continued, they would arbitrarily change the rules of the Senate to require only 51 votes to cut off debate, not the 60 now required. That strategy was quickly dubbed the nuclear option because of the massive damage it would do to the Senate as the place in government where the principle of majority rule has been softened by the framers to prevent the majority from riding roughshod over the minority. To justify the strategy, Republicans claimed that a Senate vote on a judge was constitutionally required. But when pressed, Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist agreed that there was no such provision in the Constitution. Since Republicans themselves had used various strategies to block dozens of Clinton nominees from receiving votes, few took their constitutional argument seriously, although it was repeated incessantly. The next GOP argument was that there were no precedents for using filibusters against judicial nomination. The Senate debate rules makes no distinction between judicial nomination and other matters. And the Republican filibuster of the nomination of Abe Fortas in the 1960s proved the argument was false, although it too was constantly and shamelessly repeated. Our argument was that the Constitution is simple and direct. The President's nominations need the Senate's consent, and if he does not get it, for whatever reason, the nomination fails. That's been the rule for 200 years. Every Republican knew it. Most important of all, in order to change the Senate rule requiring 60 votes to cut off the debate, the current rule requires that an even larger majority, 67 votes, is needed to stop the debate and move to a vote on the rules change itself. The Senate has such a rule because it is not and has never been a majoritarian institution. Its own structure, with 2 senators from each state, regardless of the size, was a fundamental commitment by the framers to prevent tyranny by the majority. The ability of a strong minority in the Senate to be heard, and heard as long as necessary to make its point, or even to prevent action at all, enable the Senate to maximize its role in the system of checks and balances, to be the final break when the House of Representatives or the White House was at risk of being too extreme. That role of the Senate is especially important when it's fulfilling its obligation to protect the independence of the courts from a president who is attempting to pack the courts with ideological clones of the most extreme adherents. Republicans knew that if they obeyed the rules, they did not have the 67 votes needed to change the rules. So they decided to break the rules by insisting that a majority of 51 could abolish the filibuster rules. With the Vice President on hand to break a 50-50 tie, they said that they would need only 50 Senate votes. In doing so, they would have rendered the minority in the Senate as powerless as the minority in the House, where the party in power gives the minority party almost no say in what legislation passes or even what amendments can be voted on. The nuclear option would cause a far-reaching transformation in the constitutional role of the Senate, destroying the system of checks and balances that the framers relied on to keep the nation from veering off course. It would allow an aggregation of power not seen since King George was our monarch. It would allow Republicans who already control the White House, the House of Representatives, and to a large extent the Senate, to bring the courts to heel as well. It would be a modern demonstration of the truth that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Not all Republicans were eager to take that unprecedented step. They felt the end they supported did not justify the means that were being asked to use to reach it. Principled dissent began bubbling up in the Senate Republican caucus and among former Republican senators respected by their current colleagues. Other Republicans took a pragmatic view. They recognized that the pendulum of politics could swing and install a new Democratic majority in their place, and they would not want that majority to have unlimited power. When the full story of the Senate's recent nuclear standoff is written, we may well find that over a dozen and perhaps 24 Republicans had serious doubts about where their leadership was leading them. And so negotiations began that led to the bipartisan agreement last week in which 7 Democrats agreed to be especially selective in their support for filibusters, and 7 Republicans agreed not to support the nuclear option. Their votes alone could decide the outcome of any filibuster or any attempt to use the nuclear option. Their agreement had 4 basic parts. First, the 7 Democrats agreed to vote to end a filibuster on 3 extreme pending nominees, but reserve the option to support a filibuster on 2 other nominees. Second, on future nominations, the 7 Democrats agreed that the filibuster should be supported only under extraordinary circumstances, a standard left to each one's own discretion. Third, in return, the 7 Republicans agreed to oppose the nuclear option for the rest of this Congress, that is, until the next Congress convenes in January 2007. Fourth, emphasizing the advice part of the advice and consent requirement of the Constitution, all 14 senators urged the President to consult with members of the Senate, both Democrat and Republican, before submitting judicial nominations. This was certainly true during President Clinton's time. Jamie Gorelick, who was the Deputy Attorney General, constantly talked with Orrin Hatch prior to the time of the submission of any of the nominees that were sent, I mean, in particular with regards to the 2 Supreme Court nominees. As a result of that, there were even a number of individuals whose names never came to the United States Senate. When I first heard about the agreement, I was disappointed, since we strongly opposed the 3 nominees who were given a green light for confirmation. As a result of the agreement, one of them, Priscilla Owen, has already been confirmed, despite repeated criticism from President Bush's own Attorney General, when he served with her on the Texas Supreme Court, that she was a judicial activist who invented law to reflect her own extreme ideology. The second, Janice Rogers Brown, is outspoken against the New Deal and against regulation of business, has even criticized senior citizens as persons who cannibalize their children by expecting Social Security in their old age. The third pending nominee, William Pryor, opposes the Voting Rights Act, the Americans with Disability Act, and other progress long since accepted by most citizens. He also has a series of ethical problems which the Senate Judiciary Committee has refused to investigate adequately. The dust is still settling on the agreement, and it is impossible to predict even its short-term prospects, since further controversial nominees to the courts of appeal are pending, and a possible Supreme Court vacancy is on the horizon, perhaps as early as the end of this month. Your own New York Law School graduate and poet laureate, Wallace Stevens, offers some guidance in situations like this. In his book of essays, The Necessary Angel, published in 1951, he said, "Imagination is the power that enables us to perceive the normal in the abnormal, the opposite of chaos in chaos. So we must ask ourselves, what happened in the Senate last month the normal or abnormal? Was it chaos or the opposite of chaos? I hope it'll turn out to be a triumph of the imagination in the service of the public interest, a triumph of the normal over the abnormal. I hope historians will be able to say that the opposite of chaos arose out of chaos." Even though last week the agreement was never voted on, and even though it was never subscribed to by a majority of the Senate, it stands for now as a significant monument to the best of the Senate and a strong legacy for the Senate's future. It reflects the vital fact that we who happen to be senators now do not own the institution or its powers. We are guardians of a trust established 218 years ago for the benefit of the nation and its people, a trust that has served the nation well ever since. The agreement reminds us that we cannot, and we must not, squander the precious legacy entrusted to us by our ancestors. We cannot and must not surrender any part of the powers which they gave us and which have become essential to the nation's vitality and resilience. The 14 signers of the agreement spoke for all of us, not so much in the immediate details of the way they broke the Senate impasse, but in the reaffirmation of 200 years of precedent and tradition, the normality of the United States Senate, where debates and deliberation and negotiation and compromise have always been paramount. Instead of the chaos of broken rules and broken comedy, we had the opposite of chaos, an explicit confirmation that the filibuster, a unique senatorial instrument for achieving thoughtful compromise, is permissible and legitimate for judicial nominations in circumstances where an overreaching executive needs restraint by the Senate. And we had normality in the compact's clear counsel to the President that the phrase advice and consent is not optional. It is a command that still resonates across the years. If the President wishes our consent, he must first seek and consider advice from the broad spectrum of opinion among senators who have the power to consent to his nominations or to withhold that consent. There is a certain poetic quality to the agreement itself. Lovers will never recite it in the moonlight. But if it survives the imminent storm and becomes firmly established in years to come, lovers of freedom and democracy and the Senate and America will find meaning and inspiration in its words and guidance. In a society under the law, where the precedent is so important, stare decisis widely governs how we live, that is no small achievement. I hope I'm correct that we have all been witnesses to a consequential moment of the nation's history, where we came to the brink of a constitutional precipice and were pulled back by 2 centuries of tradition and trust and by 14 courageous men and women. They helped us to see ourselves through the eyes of those who first set this nation on its amazing journey and who set enduring guidelines to prevent those who now steer the ship of state from steering it onto the rocks. The story of Benjamin Franklin's comment to a Philadelphian he met as he left the Constitutional Convention is much quoted and is apt again now. Dr. Franklin, what kind of government do we have? She asked. A republic, madam, he replied, if you can keep it. We've just lived through another of those times he had in mind, and I hope we have kept it. Thank you. That's good. You want to ask you some questions? Sure. Yeah. You want to?
Thank you, everyone. Senator Kennedy has a few moments for some questions. You'll notice that there is a microphone set up on this side of the room and one on that side of the room. And go to the mic if you want to ask a question.
Senator, hi. I want to go back to, in your tenure in the Senate, and I think also your tenure on the Judiciary Committee, you talked about different presidents and their consulting with the Senate and getting the Senate's advice on nominations. If you're willing to characterize, how does this president stack up historically with the different presidents you've dealt with on the Judiciary Committee?
Well, I think everyone heard the question. Not well. Not well at all. I gave the example of President Clinton, and Republicans and Democrats agree that during that period of time they had consultation, and even with the consultation there were 62 nominees that were denied even the vote in the United States Senate, that were kept in the committee, denied even action within the committee. And these were highly qualified men and women over a long period of time. And actually there were 2 instances where they were actually members that were filibustered, in which Bill Frist was actually a participant in that. But nonetheless, the President Clinton felt that it was important that they have some kind of an input. I believe that most of the presidents, going back at least to the time of my brother, had a way of communicating with the members of the judiciary, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and the leaders, by and large. I think, quite frankly, this really changed at the time we had Robert Bork. I think that was really the defining difference in the modern consideration of the judiciary. I'd sort of had my eye on Robert Bork from the time when he fired Archibald Cox at the time of the Watergate, and he was the figure finally that the Justice Department relied on to provide for the firing and the denial of the investigation. Then he went back up to Yale, taught up there for a while, went into different practices, but he was always on a list of the Republicans, and then he was sent up to the Judiciary Committee. It was always clear in my mind at that time he was set up for ideological purposes. It was very, very clear what was being attempted at that time. So really for the first time, the ideological issues rose and became an important factor, and people have complained about when did it really start with the testing of the ideological issues. It really started with Robert Bork. When I first arrived in the United States Senate, I basically, Republicans and Democrats, I mean, I voted for Scalia. So it goes back of what most of us thought. People, they made the recommendation by the president, and they were highly regarded and respected. There was a general kinds of presumption, heavily presumption, that we weren't going to really go very far beyond it. I've changed completely now. And unless any nominee can demonstrate to me their core commitment to the fundamental values in the Constitution, I'm not voting for that person. I mean, that's my judgment. And I used that and voted against Souter, who's been, I think, an outstanding jurist. But I can remember during the course of the hearings on Souter in the morning, he answered sort of questions, and then there's sort of an atmosphere around whether the nominee's getting through or not. And if they get it, they have a sense that they've got it sort of pretty well locked up on both sides on it. You find out that their answers get vaguer and vaguer and vaguer as the hearing goes on. This is, I'm telling you, the absolute truth. The other phenomenon that's happened, listen to this. For any of the judges that get sent up under this administration, they have all of the recent judicial hearings with all of the recent nominees, all videotaped. And what they will take is, how did Justice Kennedy deal with the Roe v. Wade? How did he get through it? What were the questions? I always give every nominee all of the questions I'm going to ask them. I'm interested in the issues of privacy. I'm interested in civil rights, separation of church and state, the basic presumptions in terms of legality of actions that we take, so they're not going to be overruled. What is First Amendment issues, which are so important. A range of different constitutional issues. I give that to that so that they can come up and it's not a game and they can answer, and I question them further about it. But what happens now is that they go down on the sticky issues that may get any of them in trouble, and they watch the video for day after day to find out how they ought to weave their way through. So at the present time, the Justice Department and the White House knows the real positions on that, but the Judiciary Committee doesn't know, and the American people don't know. So if they're going to have, that's going to be their score, they're going to have to be able, at least as far as this Senate to go, to be able to demonstrate their core commitment, because I'm not going to be satisfied that they've got the right answer, they've got the right word there, they know how to answer that and repeat the words that Kennedy repeated going on through on Roe v. Wade, or maybe the same kinds of words that others did to be able to, escape real kind of accountability. That's what's happened in this process, and has turned it much more into sort of a game rather than a real set of hearings where one side knows all of the answers of this. I know a nominee for that was suggested for the Second Circuit, and he came down being interviewed by the two young Federalists in the Justice Department. They asked him who his favorite justice was, and he said Souter. No, we're not kidding. Who is your favorite justice? And he mentioned Souter again, and they said, well, thank you very much. This interview is all over. Boom, it's out there. So this is what we, and a wonderful story that Burke Marshall, when he went back to teaching up at Yale, he said he'd always get asked in the first part of his course, how come President Kennedy named Justice Byron White to the Supreme Court? And Burke would say, well, first of all, he served as the Deputy Attorney General, did an outstanding job. He was an outstanding partner in a law firm. He was an outstanding legal mind. He had an incredible war record, 3 Silver Stars in World War II. President Kennedy was also interested in the fact he played football and was all that kind of interested him. And he, by the way, was a very early supporter of President Kennedy. And they appointed him. And he says the whole class just laughs. They don't believe that President Kennedy didn't have some conversation with Byron White about issues that were going to come up. None of them believe it. None of them believe it. Young students, they all believe that people all have an understanding and awareness of it. I think they do today. I don't think they did then. And I think that's something that we've got to be guarded against as we go down the road in terms of the future.
I'm interested in the future of funding for the arts and the humanities, which I see rapidly diminishing. It seems that this administration has really no interest in it. And how do you see the future of the NEA and the National Endowment for the Humanities?
The NEA and the National Endowment of the Humanities, and they each get funded about $105, $110 million a year. They were both extraordinarily threatened probably 4 or 5 years ago when there was the Mapplethorpe and the exhibit, and they had given some. They had participated in a couple of grants, or at least been in the building or in the world when these things were being taken, and this just about finished it off. This is a very interesting issue. And when it looked like all the funding was ended for both of the agencies, then when I forget the decision on obscenity. Who's a good dean? You could tell me. What was the Miller case? What was the? Yeah. Well, what was the name of the decision? Ken. What was the name of it? Thank you, Ken. So I've been waiting to get at that guy for all these years. But you remember the one in Potter Stewart said, when you can see it, well, know it, the definition. But I think it's like a Miller case or one of those. But in any event, we came to the compromise and said, all right, we will put in a Miller type of language. So if it's seen as obscene in Pocatello, by the local judges, the individual has to return the grant, okay? But if it's seen as not being obscene in New York City, they don't have to. That was the compromise, basically. I think you get the gist of it without getting into it. We had 70% of the art world said, no, that's not good enough. We're not going to accept that because that is a form of censorship. And even the supporters of this were completely divided on this, about whether we ought to go ahead or not. And the judgment was, so it was a very close vote, because you had people that have been strong support for the arts voted against it because they thought that this was still putting some kind of censorship in terms of it. But that went through and carried, and it's been in there ever since. And I think they've done reasonably well over the period of time in the last. I think they have done. Humanities have done very well. I think the arts have done really quite well. I mean, there was a lot of concern, many of us have, in terms of the independence of science, for example, and the politicization of science, which is taking place. And we thought that this would move very, very quickly into the arts, and it has not been as evident there as it has been in the areas of science and basic research, which is taking place in the NIH, which is a horrendous sort of situation. I'll just wind up. I'll just take a final question.
Is there anything specific we the people can do to keep away the founding fathers' intended?
Well, the question on the ways that we can still preserve the Constitution, the way the founding fathers, I think we need a few more Democrats. I think to start with. It's a kind of a flip answer, but it's true. And also, I think some more independent Republicans. I mentioned very briefly. Most of the Republicans now in the Senate have come through the House, and they have a discipline in that House and follow the discipline, and it's very easy for them to fall right into that kind of regime in the Senate of the United States. That wasn't true. I mean, you had Jack Javits coming out of New York. Can you believe Jack would have gone along with this Republican leadership? He would say, I'm not going to do this. He was an independent, brilliant human being. And or even Chuck Percy had been the head of Bell and Howell, and Cliff Case from New Jersey. This was an entirely different group of men. They were men at that time, but they had all had great success in the private sector and came in to the Senate, and they had strong views and visions about it, and they were indispensable. in terms of the Senate and working coalitions. That was true in terms of the civil rights issues and also in ending the war. And we don't have that now. The principal leaders, the Republicans now have all come from the House, and they basically are just in lockstep with the Republicans, and that has to alter and change. But I'm hopeful that this is a very uneasy, truce, and I'm not sure how eventually it'll sort of work out. They put additional tensions on it with the Bolton nomination because he refuses to provide material. I mean, we were all familiar with the secrecy of this administration. I mean, even on something as mundane as base closings. I've been under 5 BRACs, the base closings, and they released the documents about how they made decisions. They've classified all these. So communities don't even know how this, with secrecy. So I said to John Warner, why are we doing the secrecy on this thing? And he said, because it's after 9/11. I said, we feared the Taliban in Afghanistan more than the Russians, with all of their spies all over. Well, I'm just telling you. But that's just a climate and an atmosphere. But you're familiar with this, all the secrecy. I'll just wind up on the questions. First time I went out for my brother in 1959, I went to Montana, and I spoke to some Democrats. They said there's some farmers down the road, and they're going to send some delegates to the Democratic Convention. I said, well, I'll go down and talk to them. So I went down, I talked to them about my brother, and then I always noticed that he asked were there any questions, so I thought, well, I'll try the same thing. So I said, are there any questions? And a hand went out to the back of the room and said, Mr. Kennedy, how does your brother stand on 90% of parity for wheat on controlled acreage? And I had absolutely no idea. I still don't know what the answer is on that one. But I remembered a story that happened to him when he was in intelligence before he went out the Pacific in World War II. He went to South Carolina and he's talking to the group of workers about the dangers of sabotage in a factory. And he spelled out to the workers that if they saw a fire in the factory, they ought to determine the origin of the fire in order to determine how to extinguish it. And if the fire was made from wood, make sure you put water on it. If it's oil and gas, put CO2 on it. If it's electricity, put foam on it. But never put water on an oil and gas fire because it would spread and have disastrous results. So he finished it, and he said, are there any questions? And a hand went up in the back of the room and said, well, now, Ensign Kennedy, if we look in the back of the hall and we see a fire back there, how are we going to know? Just by looking at it, whether it's made from wood, oil and gas, or electricity, so we know exactly what to put on it and what not to put on it. So we thought about that for a while, and he said, that's a very good question, and there'll be someone here next week who'll talk on that very subject. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
At cspan.org, click on Judicial Nominations for updated information on the federal judiciary. Read the new Senate agreement on judicial nominations. Watch remarks from senators about the compromise and video of confirmation hearings. Also, biographies of federal court nominees. For the latest information on judicial nominations and Senate rules, go to cspan.org.
Sunday, on C-SPAN's Q&A. Washington Times editor-in-chief Wes Pruden.
I think a lot of the elite newspapers, the Washington Post and New York Times, no longer reflect the diversity of the country.
Wes Pruden, Sunday night at 8 Eastern and Pacific on C-SPAN's Q&A.